A to Z Mysteries, The New Year Dragon Dilemma, Super Edition 5, by Ron Roy. Chapter 5. "Where did she go?" Josh asked. "Where did who go?" said a voice behind the kids. It was Holden. He was out of breath, as if he'd been running. "I had to make a porta-potty call," he said. "Did Miss Chinatown take off her mask yet?" "She's not on the float," Ruth Rose said. "She's gone." Holden looked confused. "What?" "Look," Josh said. He tugged Holden's arm to bring him closer to the fence. Miss Chinatown was there, throwing candy. Then, after the fireworks, she was gone, just like that. Holden stared at the swan float. Suddenly, he vaulted over the fence and raced after the float. Dink, Josh, and Ruth Rose watched him run to the front of the truck cab and wave his arms. The truck stopped, and the driver's door opened. A woman wearing denim coveralls stepped out and began yelling at Holden. By now, the crowd around the kids had noticed that something was wrong. Dink heard voices saying, "What's going on? Where's Miss Chinatown? What's that guy doing in front of the float?" There were dozens of other floats behind the swan float, all waiting for the parade to continue. Drivers were stepping out of their trucks. Some were tooting their horns as if this were an ordinary traffic jam. People in the crowd began to get upset. Some guy yelled, "This is a bogus parade." A little kid asked, "Isn't there any more candy?" Another kid answered, "Duh, Billy, the candy lady took off." Dink suddenly remembered something Holden had told them earlier. He said he hadn't heard from Lily in 2 days. No phone calls, no text messages. He had said he was worried about her. Now she was gone. Or at least Miss Chinatown was gone. "Come on, guys," Ruth Rose said. She grabbed the top of the fence, wedged one sneaker toe against it, and threw her other leg over. "What are you doing?" Dink asked. "We're supposed to stay with Holden," Ruth Rose said. "Besides, I'm not missing this." She pulled her other leg over the top of the fence, then dropped to the ground on the other side. "Me either," Josh said. He followed Ruth Rose over the fence. Dink watched his two friends run toward the swan float. Gulping a deep breath, he followed them. When Dink reached the float, Holden and the truck driver had stopped yelling at each other. Dink joined Josh and Ruth Rose, who were standing behind Holden. "I didn't see Miss Chinatown at all," the driver was telling Holden. "I was just watching the road in front of me. I don't know anything about whatever happened behind me." Just then, 2 police officers approached. "What are you kids doing inside the fence?" one of them asked. A name tag on his uniform jacket said Officer Goodman. "We came to help our friend," Dink said, pointing at Holden. "They're with me," Holden said. "Yeah, and who are you?" the other officer asked Holden. Her name tag read Officer Feist. "And what are you doing here? That fence is meant to keep folks out." I'm Holden Wong," Holden said. "I'm looking for my girlfriend, Lily. She was—" "What is going on here?" an angry voice interrupted. "This parade must proceed. Why have you stopped the float?" Dink jumped at the loud voice. He turned to see a man storming up to the group. He wore a suit the color of vanilla ice cream. His white hair was swept back off his forehead. He had a thin white mustache and a red face. His dark eyes flashed anger as he charged toward the float. "Excuse me, sir," Officer Goodman said. "Who are you?" The man glared at Officer Goodman. He took a deep breath and closed his eyes for a second. "Dr. Winston Worthington," he said finally. "I am the parade manager. Now please answer my question. Under whose authority did you stop this float?" Dink looked up at the angry man's red face. A blood vessel in his forehead was bulging like a small snake under the skin. Dr. Worthington's eyes darted around the group, looking for someone to blame. His hands had formed into fists. Dink knew he'd never seen this man before, but somehow he looked familiar. I stopped the float, Holden said. My girl, and you are? Dr. Worthington asked. Officer Fye stepped forward. Sir, Miss Chinatown has disappeared off the float, she said. This young man thinks it was his girlfriend. She looked at Holden. What's her name? Lily Chen, Holden said. Miss Chinatown disappeared, Dr. Worthington interrupted. His red face turned pale. But that's impossible. He turned to the float driver. How do we get up on this thing? Easy peasy, the driver said. There's a ladder. She walked to the opposite side of the float. A small ladder was attached to the truck. It was partly hidden in blue flowers, and so narrow only a small person could climb its rungs. I'm not climbing that silly thing, Dr. Worthington said. There must be another way. How do the workers get up and down? There's a ramp in the back, the driver said. This truck hauls freight when it's not used for parades. Come on, I'll show you. The woman hurried to the back of the float and unhooked a rear section of the truck's bed. It made a ramp, which the driver lowered to the road. Dr. Worthington marched up the ramp, quickly followed by the two police officers and Holden. Come on, guys, Ruth Rose whispered. Following her lead, Dink and Josh clambered up the ramp. They all stood in the middle of the huge swan. Its wings spread above them, completely covered in white flower blossoms. The thousands of blossoms gave off a thick, sweet smell. She was right here, Holden said. He took a step forward. Lily's not very tall. She must have stood on that box so we could see her. Something crackled under Holden's foot. Dink looked down and saw wrapped candies scattered on the floor. Just behind the swan's neck stood a wooden box, the size of a large toy chest. Well, I can see that she's not here, but how did she get off the float? Officer Goodman asked. I mean, nobody saw her climb down that ladder, right? She wouldn't just leave, Holden said. Someone must have taken her. But who? She was alone on the float, right? Officer Feist asked. Enough talking, Dr. Worthington spluttered. Can we just get my parade moving again? Sir, we have a situation here, Officer Goodman said. Once we figure out what's going on, the parade will continue. Dink felt Ruth Rose nudge his arm. Look, she murmured in his ear and pointed toward the floor. Dink looked. He saw only the box and a bunch of wrapped candies. Then he noticed something else. A piece of black silk was sticking out from under the box. Dink recognized the sash. The last time he'd seen it, the sash had been tied around Miss Chinatown's waist.